I solemnly swear I am up to no good. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight we are going to attempt the epic endeavor of covering 3 whole chapters of Prisoner of Azkaban after I spent so long talking about Dementors last week. Tonight, chapters 6, 7, and 8 of Prisoner of Azkaban, in which Harry settles into life at Hogwarts once more, and we begin all of the myriad subplots which will sustain us through the rest of the novel. There's a lot of fun detail in these chapters, but honestly, maybe not that much plot. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to move swiftly tonight. Only a modest 14 slides to cover, a casual stroll to Hogsmeade, if you will. You can contribute live in the YouTube chat, where I see Aaron and QuinCon14 and Angela and Raina and Rohit and Becca Eller is here, and Angela's here, and Elizabeth and Brittany. Gildarts Winters is back with us once again, and Mari is joining us for the first time. Guys, it is so great to have you all here. If you have thoughts about Dear Mr. Potter in the week ahead, you can also tweet them using the hashtag Dear Mr. Potter, DearMrPotter. I will catch up with all of those. Angela says Dementors were worth it. I'm very glad. I had a really great time in last week's session, but yes, we have been left with something of an uphill struggle, though, as I say, these chapters don't contain a lot of really powerful and important moments. There are moments here that I completely adore, and we're going to close out tonight's session with, almost close out tonight's session with one of my favorite scenes in the entire book, the first real conversation between Harry and Professor Lupin, but this is partly a consequence, I think, of J.K. Rowling's conceit that each of these books should map to the school year. That leaves us with a lot of dead time. It leaves us with a lot of fallow pages, really. We're going to skip the better part of 2 months within the span of tonight's chapters, and just not much is going to happen in that time. Kate says on Twitter, my nephew stopped my brother from kissing his wife with the words, "Don't touch her, she's a portkey that will send you straight to Voldemort." I mean, obviously, I can't speak about your brother or your sister-in-law, but I've had dates like that. I know how that goes. Let's get right to it then. Before we get into our discussion of tonight's reading, though, a continuation of a thought that I had last week, where I was speculating out loud about the presence of water in Harry's description of the Dementor and in his response to the Dementor's influence. We're going to pick up on that again in the scene with Professor Lupin this week. And I talked at the time about the connection between water and, for want of a better word, evil in the world of Harry Potter, particularly apropos considering the connection between water and House Slytherin. So I spent a lot of time this week thinking about the elemental connections between the houses of Hogwarts and the wider wizarding world. And I wanted to kind of break down those elemental associations and talk a little about how the houses reflect that classical elemental archetype that you're presumably familiar with from, I don't know, every piece of pop culture produced in the last 3,000 years. House Ravenclaw is associated with the element of air, which of course makes sense in terms of their common room situated in one of the tallest towers of Hogwarts, but also, perhaps more importantly, with the connection between air and intellect and thought specifically. There is a long-standing kind of mythic and historical connection between air and thought, air and the mind. That goes back at least as far as the Greek philosopher and original cynic Diogenes, who observed that air, as the most swift and changeable of elements, was the perfect natural metaphor for human thought, human intuition, human intellect. That connection goes back even further than Diogenes, though, into the very roots of our language. The Latin word spirare, meaning to breathe, gives us modern English words like inspire and aspire and spirit. The ancient Greek word animos means wind, whereas the cognate Latin word anima or animus means soul and spirit, and notably and interestingly, courage. Not a primary value that we associate with Ravenclaw, at least not when there are Gryffindors in the room. This echoes, of course, the kind of airy, intellectual, somewhat unearthly preoccupations of Ravenclaws. That seems to me to be a pretty tight match there. House Hufflepuff, by contrast, is connected with the earth. Their common room is subterranean, but is comfortable and cozy, and is in another one of those odd J.K. Rowling / J.R.R. Tolkien crossovers that no one really talks about, basically a hobbit hole. I mean, basically, you will not find the ends of worms and an oozy smell in the Hufflepuff common room, is what I'm saying, much like Bag End itself. As air has long been mythically and etymologically connected with the spirit and the mind, so has earth been mythically and etymologically connected with the body. The Latin word homo, meaning human, has its roots in the Latin word humus, meaning earth. That's a strong etymological, kind of a primally mythic connection there. Moreover, of course, lots and lots of creation myths, basically extending as far back as human history extends, involve the bodies of human beings being crafted from clay, from rock, from earth, either directly or indirectly. The earth is constant and dependable compared with the other elements, which connects to those typically Hufflepuffian traits of loyalty and steadfastness. Homopuff, says Gildarts Winters. I mean, in the sense that all Hufflepuffs are human, presumably. Are all Hufflepuffs human? Do goblins get Hogwarts houses? Do house elves get Hogwarts houses? I mean, I suppose they do technically contractually through employment, if not by actual sorting. But now I'm interested in the non-human residents of the wizarding world. That's fascinating. Yeah. Good thought. Good thought. House Slytherin, as I said, is associated with water. Their common room can be found beneath the lake, which seems like an entirely appropriate place for them. We've seen connections between water and the Dementors, with Azkaban itself, of course, which needs few guards because it is this rocky promontory in the middle of the ocean. The flooded Chamber of Secrets is kind of representative. Even the basilisk and the inclusion of pipes and water and the plumbing of Hogwarts seems, connected back to that idea that water is, trouble. Water is mythically associated with emotions and with dreams and with changeability and with deceit and a kind of, I suppose, a casual disregard for human beings and human nature, which may be interpreted by some as ruthlessness. Think, for example, of the sirens and the selkies and the mermaids of myth who actively deceive and seduce human beings, leading them to their death. There are also obvious connections with blood. And the Proto-Indo-European root word for water gives us words like surround and undulate and inundate, and even the word winter, which I thought was fascinating and curious. So we have this idea that water is changeable, that it is not to be trusted, that it can turn against us. Water is treacherous, though of course it is necessary for life too. Interestingly, water is also the element which, mythically speaking, culturally speaking, is most likely to be associated with feminine influences rather than masculine influences. Certainly the earth sometimes is associated with feminine influences, but not always. The sky, the air, is sometimes associated with feminine influences, but not always. Fire is almost always masculine, and water is almost universally. In fact, I can't off the top of my head think of a mythic context or a cultural context in which water is primarily associated with masculine influences. So that's an interesting thought that may perhaps shed some light on future discussions of morality. Quincon14 is pointing out that Snape lives by a stream and he is the head of Slytherin. That's very good, yes. And Brittany calls out that Flitwick is half goblin and the head of Ravenclaw. Of course, I'd forgotten about Flitwick. So there you go. Presumably, I mean, Hagrid too, right? Like hybrid creatures are sorted, at least within the context of Hogwarts. I'm not sure about actual goblin culture. We don't get a lot of insight into goblin culture, which is one of those things which for nerds like me is frustrating as we move through the Harry Potter series. Water and masculine influences, says Merging Puppy. The Tempest, Old Man River, says Ryan. I guess, yes, specifically there are a couple of masculine influences, but generally we will refer to water using feminine pronouns. That seems to be much more common than any of the other elements. Lastly, Gryffindors, associated with fire, which, of course, stands apart from the other elements in two distinct and unique ways. The first is that when we talk about fire, we're generally talking about domesticated fire. We're talking about the kindling of fire. We're rarely talking about fire in its raw and primal state. We're not really talking about lightning strikes and volcanoes. We're talking about the campfire and the hearth and the torch. We're talking about these artifacts of humanity. That is to say that the element of fire is the only element which must, in order to be put to useful purpose, or in order to be kind of significant and meaningful, must be crafted or created. This speaks powerfully to the agency of the individual, to this notion of exceptionalism. A person starts the fire, and everyone benefits from it. Or doesn't benefit from it, but I'm thinking of the benign domesticated uses to which fire may be put. The Gryffindor common room, as we'll see in tonight's reading, and as we've seen many times before, occupies one of the unremarkable towers of Hogwarts, which is kind of fascinating in the sense that it is not particularly fascinating. It is remarkable in the sense that it is unremarkable. It's just one of the towers. The Ravenclaw Tower, we're told, is one of the highest in Hogwarts. It is certainly exceptional. The Hufflepuff common room is exceptional. The Hufflepuff dorms, that kind of whole suite, is exceptional in that it is subterranean and cozy. It's kind of subterranean beneath the earth. And then the Slytherin common room is exceptional because it is subterranean beneath the water. And it feels as though the Gryffindor common room is standard. It is the standard, in fact, the standard by which all the other common rooms aren't just judged, but are crucially defined. The Gryffindor common room is the normal one. It is the unexceptional one in that sense. Fire is also, of course, the only element that is not definable by a fixed or at least common physical state. Earth commonly is solid, unless you're dealing with exceptional circumstances. Water is liquid, unless you're dealing with exceptional circumstances. Air is gaseous, unless you're dealing with exceptional circumstances. But fire is simply the chemical change within another substance caused by the interaction of heat and fuel and oxygen. Fire is the transformation in effect. It is not static. It cannot, by definition, be static. Once again, we see a tripartite structure that is static, and a fourth element that is not, that is exceptional, that acts upon the others rather than having a defined form all its own. And that's completely appropriate, of course, given our discussions last week and previously on Dear Mr. Potter about the nature of the houses at Hogwarts. As I said last time, as I've said many times before, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin give us a complete model. We get everything that we need there. We get the kids who are interested in thought, the kids who are interested in body, and the kids who are interested in action. That gives us our logos, pathos, ethos structure there. It gives us our water, air, earth combination. It gives us our solid, liquid, gaseous combination. These are solid and kind of structurally sound, structurally complete metaphors. Gryffindor is the outlier, which kind of makes sense. It makes sense that fire requires the other elements to be present in order to take effect. Who is the hero? What is the hero? Unless there are people to protect, unless there are villains to fight, unless there is fame to be won. In the context of Harry Potter, the fire is illuminative, is creative, is passionate, is urgent, is generally very positive. We generally associate fire with positive things, which isn't always true within the frame of broader fantasy fiction. But we generally associate fire with positive things in the frame of Harry Potter, but they are positive things that are dependent on the pre-existing conditions of other elements, other states, other houses. Heroes are only heroes because there are people who are not heroes. There are other kids in this school. Rob Glass says, I also like the parallel that water is the more traditional rebirth symbol, but fire has its own cleansing power. That's really strong, Rob. I like that a lot. Yes. That's a really, really good observation. Yes. Oh, Joseph is joining us for the first time, a cheeky day off in New Zealand. Hopefully my son will keep napping. He says, Joseph, welcome. I wish your son good rest. I wish your son a long nap so that you can enjoy the rest of the session. Mari says, I finally get the podcast narratives about the live chat. Makes this much more complex to keep up with. Man props, Alistair. You know what? It's a lot of fun keeping up with the live chat, not without its own, its own natural challenges, but yes, good. I'm so glad to have you here. That's wonderful. Alan says, it's interesting how opposed fire and water are, and so are Slytherin and Gryffindor. Fire boils water, but water can put out fire. Okay, now I feel like I'm playing rock, paper, scissors, which you kind of are. Elemental rock, paper, scissors is pretty solid a game, let me tell you. You're right, though. There is a direct interaction, a direct kind of combative, but also potentially collaborative antipathy between fire and water that is exactly emblematic, exactly representative of the conflict between Gryffindor and Slytherin. They are, on the one hand, completely different. They are polar opposites, but on the other, they are kind of mutually engaged. Again, there is, you're right, a kind of reciprocal definition there that I find very interesting, that I find really functionally fascinating as we move through the book, and particularly once we get out of Prisoner of Azkaban, once we get into the rest of the series, and we're really engaged in this kind of almost formal restructuring of our notions of what the houses are. As I said, in fact, I've said before that the Harry Potter series splits into two halves as far as the houses are concerned, and kind of Rowling's understanding of the houses and her definition of the houses. And I have said previously that it's the first two books where everything is super simple, and Gryffindor really is just house good guys, and Slytherin really is just house bad guys. And that is going to become more complicated. But it is fair to say that, as in so many other ways, Prisoner of Azkaban is a transitional novel. It is a liminal novel in that sense. This is not so much a book which belongs to either part. I keep wanting to say half, but of course that is mathematically incorrect. But Prisoner of Azkaban doesn't belong to either half of the Harry Potter saga, but it is the turning point between. This is the threshold novel, and the novels that we get after this will be very different, will be much more adult and much more sophisticated, certainly much more ambitious, certainly much more well-developed. And that's not to suggest that the first two books aren't well-developed or ambitious, but we're going to really step up as we move into the rest of the series. Jamie says, Gryffindor and Slytherin always seem to need each other to define who they are. Gryffindors rarely need to be brave in the faces of Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw actions. That is beautifully put, Jamie. You are absolutely right. That's exactly what I was getting at. Good. Good. And Jamie says, fire makes me think of Fawkes, who demonstrates the transformative nature of fire. Absolutely. This entire conversation was making me think of, the climax of Chamber of Secrets, where we have this direct kind of mythic opposition of fire and water, and it's not the mythic opposition that you might expect. If you come to Harry Potter with a solid grounding in other fantasy fiction, then fire bad, water good is generally how that breaks out. Is generally that's the kind of interpretation that we get there. You have the fire breathing. I'm thinking in part here, of course, of the last movement of The Hobbit, the death of the fire breathing dragon Smaug as he plunges into the lake after being struck by the black arrow, and the way that the lake consumes him, the way that the lake effortlessly kind of absorbs and dominates Smaug and ultimately kills him, of course. I mean, as he plunges into those icy waters. That is a much more typical fantasy trope, which is then, of course, subverted by J.R.R. Tolkien in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. He does much more interesting things with fire and water to the water. Yeah, no, water in the pages of The Lord of the Rings generally 100% positive. Water is a good thing. It is a good force. But here Rowling has taken a very different approach that opens up some real subtlety and complexity in the storytelling here. Let me see here. Rohit says, interesting, a lot of people seem to think Goblet of Fire is a transition novel. Goblet of Fire is the novel which kind of delivers on the transition. It is the kind of first step, I think, on the other side of the threshold, which we'll discuss, of course, when we get to Goblet of Fire in the very near future. But for me, Azkaban is the novel where you can see that turning point happen. This is the moment where we are suspended between. This is not Philosopher's Stone or Chamber of Secrets. This is not a... Again, I always want to kind of emphasize that I do not mean this in a derogatory way. I certainly don't mean to diminish the first two books in this series, but this is not a juvenile novel in the way that the first two books are juvenile novels. But it is also not yet a kind of modern young adult novel in the way that the latter books in the series are going to be young adult novels. This is the point at which we turn. It's also the point at which we're turning in terms of our understanding of the wizarding world and the muggle world, the way in which we're turning in our understanding of the kind of boarding school adventure side of this story versus the fantasy story side of this story, and Harry's own role in this world. It's so rich and so complex, which for me is one of the reasons why it's my favorite book in the series. Yeah. Good. Okay, I think I'm all caught up here. Excellent. Oh, Quincom14 says earth and air are kind of opposites too, but not as competitively as fire and water. Yeah, this is the crux of this, right? Is that air and earth, again, kind of archetypally, elementally, if you will, are opposed, but they're not in direct conflict, because the air cannot really influence the earth, not in any kind of long-standing way, and the earth cannot influence the air in any long-standing way. But fire and water are not just mutually antagonistic, but mutually destructive. They will destroy each other upon exposure, and that's key to understanding, I think, part of the antagonism between Gryffindor and Slytherin. I'm always fascinated when we get these very slight and subtle kind of perspectives on the relationship between House Slytherin and the other houses of Gryffindor. It's clear that Hufflepuffs are distrustful of Slytherin, and that Ravenclaw are dismissive of Slytherin primarily, which makes a lot of sense and is certainly true to their characters, but there's a more complex relationship there, the kind of complex relationship that would exist if we removed Gryffindor from the structure entirely. It's almost as though, you get the sense that Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs are just backing away whenever one of these conflicts breaks out. Again, at this point, later we're going to revise this and it's going to become more complex and that will no longer be true. But at this point, you get the sense that they're just kind of, okay, let's let the heroes go at each other and we'll just kind of step back and do our thing. Yeah. Okay. I think I am caught up here. Kevin says every time someone says liminal in a Harry Potter podcast, a Cornish pixie gets its wings. Liminal is one of the most useful words when we're describing Harry Potter because J.K. Rowling's mastery of the threshold as a narrative structure and a narrative conceit is pretty much unparalleled in modern fantasy fiction. She has just nailed it, which is one of the things that connects Rowling back to the oldest traditions of fairy tale storytellers. Fairy tales are defined by the presence of that threshold, by the presence of that liminal and transliminal state, and Rowling manages to enfold that into a story that really has no need of this mastery with effortless grace. It's beautiful. And to someone like me who kind of is fascinated by fairy tale story structure and by the transits between the mundane world and the world of fairy, or as we get in Harry Potter, the Muggle world and the Wizarding world, I'm just obsessed with that anyway. And seeing Rowling deploy them so beautifully and marking them so beautifully is always a thrill, though that too will kind of fade away as we move into the rest of the series. This is kind of a high point there. Yeah. Karen is saying with a certain amount of irony that we're totally going to get through all the chapters tonight. Okay, we're 20 minutes in. Let's do this thing. And we'll begin with Professor Trelawney's divination class here, right at the beginning of the school year. At these words, both Harry and Ron glanced, grinning at Hermione, who looked startled at the news that books wouldn't be much help in the subject. Many witches and wizards, talented though they are in the area of loud bangs and smells and sudden disappearings, are yet unable to penetrate the veiled mystery of the future, Professor Trelawney went on, her enormous gleaming eyes moving from face to nervous face. It is a gift granted to few. You, boy, she said suddenly to Neville, who almost toppled off his poof. Is your grandmother well? I think so, said Neville tremulously. I wouldn't be so sure if I were you, dear, said Professor Trelawney, the firelight glinting on her long emerald earrings. Neville gulped. Professor Trelawney continued placidly. We will be covering the basic methods of divination this year. The first term will be devoted to reading the tea leaves. Next term we shall progress to palmistry. By the way, my dear, she shot suddenly at Parvati Patil, beware a red-headed man. Parvati gave a startled look at Ron, who was right behind her, and edged her chair away from him. In the second term, Professor Trelawney went on, we shall progress to the crystal ball if you have finished with fire omens, that is. Unfortunately, classes will be disrupted in February by a nasty bout of flu. I myself will lose my voice. And around Easter, one of our number will leave us forever. Even in wizarding school, divination is an art that is looked on with a certain amount of suspicion. And we have talked previously, particularly back in, particularly back in the first book, where we were really talking about the structure of Hogwarts and the way that magic works. And more recently, as we were speculating about the applications of wild magic, of accidental magic, versus the more formalized structures of wand-based, spell-based magic, the kind of magic that is taught at Hogwarts. We've talked about that distinction, and we've talked about the way in which magic appears to be formalized. Someone at some point comes up with a spell, and that spell is replicated. There are defined structures to magic. The fact that Harry and Hermione and Ron and all the other kids in Hogwarts are taking specific individualized classes speaks to that notion of compartmentalization, that this is at least as much craft as it is art, and arguably, certainly from Hermione's perspective, much more craft than it is art. But within that frame, divination stands apart, as it should, because divination is always going to be unreliable. It is always going to be kind of, by definition, untrustworthy. It's a fascinating kind of addition to the Hogwarts curriculum that we see here, the Hogwarts syllabus. Yes, Eric says, Trelawney was quite right often, actually. It might be cold reading, but still. Well, this is the thing. Is it a legitimate form of magic? Well, yes. Unarguably, in the pages of Harry Potter, there is a divinatory power. It is possible for some wizards, under certain circumstances, to tell the future. that is evidently and manifestly true. But as Merging Puppy calls out here in the YouTube chat, divination may be treated with suspicion, but what does it say that it is still taught? Exactly. It may be unreliable, but it is also important. And we, I think, particularly as adults, particularly as we're looking at this with adult eyes, understand that because of its inclusion in the context, the broadest possible context of Hogwarts and the wizarding world. It makes a lot of sense for divination to be included, even if it is unreliable. These two things are not mutually exclusive, but they are mutually exclusive to the Ravenclaw mind. Hermione has trouble with this because it is so difficult to pin down. Joseph calls that, this is a really great call. Yes, divination, opposite end of the spectrum from potions. Yes, exactly. We've discussed before the ways in which potions, the alchemical craft at Hogwarts, is craft. That it is, if you'll forgive a near pun here, it is formulaic. It is almost entirely separated from the kind of personal creativity that we associate with other forms of magic and spellcasting. Potions is 100% craft. Divination, as Professor Trelawney seems to imply here, is basically 100% art, or if we prefer, 100% inspiration rather than perspiration, or 100% raw talent versus practice. It seems as though presumably any wizard with sufficient time and sufficient technique could study potions and become a master of potions. That it is simply rigorous in that sense, and divination is not. We're drawing a really great kind of opposition here with Hermione, and for the first time really in the books to date, we're pushing Hermione out of our power trio. We're kind of pulling her away from Hermione, from Harry and Ron, excuse me. We're going to see Hermione and Ron pretty much on the outs over the whole Crookshanks Scabbers conflict in the course of the next few chapters, which is really great foreshadowing and very skillful handling of the plot, because our suspicion is put resolutely on Crookshanks, as it should be at this point. This is a piece of narrative scaffolding that is more sophisticated, I would argue, than anything we've seen from J.K. Rowling in either of the previous books. The way that her craft has developed now, so that she can do things like the Crookshanks Scabbers conflict, and so she can do things like the Time Turner subplot. She does that so skillfully through this book that it is easy to miss the first time through. Emmy James says, the future is always in flux until it happens. Divination by its nature is perceived as untrustworthy because knowledge of the potential future could lead us to alter that future. That's exactly right, Emmy. I think that's a really great point. Really great divination would be ultimately self-destructive, because if you are capable of predicting the future with 100% accuracy, if instead of telling Parvati Patil, beware a red-headed man, we were able to tell her, okay, this guy is going to show up in your life, he is dangerous, take the necessary precautions, then we would change the future, and divination itself would be irrelevant. It's curious. It's interesting. Jamie says, however, even with potions, there seems to be only so much that can be taught. It's like there are people who study biology, and then there are those people who study theoretical physics. I do think that, let me take the slide down. I do think that there are two sides to potion making, and I do think that natural aptitude, certainly, the ability to think in the necessary way is absolutely necessary for success at potion making. I think that even an untalented and unskilled wizard could become adequate at potion making, certainly kind of entry-level potion making. But of course, as we talked about before, the wizarding world is evolving. It is changing. By the time we get to Prisoner of Azkaban, we get a stronger sense here that the wizarding world is continuing to refine magical art and practice. Thus, we're going to have potion masters who are skilled at creating new potions or at improving and refining existing potions, and that will presumably take a certain amount of inspiration, a certain amount of art there, coupled with the craft of kind of standard potion making. Yeah. Okay, let's keep pushing on and get to the most important element of divination's class so far, the Grim. My dear, Professor Trelawney's huge eyes opened dramatically. You have the Grim. The what? Said Harry. He could tell that he wasn't the only one who didn't understand. Dean Thomas shrugged at him, and Lavender Brown looked puzzled, but nearly everybody else clapped their hands to their mouths in horror. The Grim, my dear, the Grim, cried Professor Trelawney, who looked shocked that Harry hadn't understood. The giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards. My dear boy, it is an omen, the worst omen of death. Harry's stomach lurched. The dog on the cover of Death Omens and Flourish and Blots. The dog in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent. Lavender Brown clapped her hands to her mouth too. Everyone was looking at Harry. Everyone except Hermione, who had gotten up and moved round to the back of Professor Trelawney's chair. I don't think it looks like a Grim, she said flatly. Professor Trelawney surveyed Hermione with mounting dislike. You'll forgive me for saying so, my dear, but I perceive very little aura around you, very little receptivity to the resonances of the future. The Grim. The Grim is a fascinating mythic concept. One of three fascinating mythic concepts that we're going to visit with tonight in the span of this reading. We're going to talk about the Grim, we're going to talk about the Boggart, and then we're going to talk about hippogriffs. So this is J.K. Rowling kind of plundering her big book, O Myths, to draw interesting elements into the frame of this text. This is particularly relevant for me as a Scotsman, particularly as a Scotsman who grew up in the Northeast, on the Northeast coast of Scotland, in fact, because in Scottish folklore, we have the Cúshí, which is the large black dog that anticipates death. The Cúshí as a harbinger of death is pretty much the Scottish version of the Banshee from Irish mythology. The appearance of this large and monstrous black dog, sometimes with glowing eyes, sometimes without, that warns of imminent death and oftentimes imminent grief in a broader sense. It isn't always, depending on where you are in Scotland, it isn't always outright physical death and tragedy, but sometimes it is simply, ill tidings. It is grave news. Yes. A lot of Grims in Scotland, says Eric. Yes, certainly. Mythically, at least, in Scottish folklore, at least. Yes. So it is appropriate that we're using the Grim, given that Hogwarts is in Scotland, but Scotland does not have the market cornered in terms of giant black dogs as harbingers of death. This is a really curious mythic tradition that extends outward really from a kind of Central European conceit. You will find this in Teutonic mythology. You will find this in Slavic mythology. You will find this in Nordic mythology. It's kind of all over the place, but it is pretty much uniquely European, at least uniquely European in primary derivation. So we're really tapping into that idea, but much more importantly here, Harry is making the connection. And again, I'm just calling this out all the time, but Rowling's mastery of kind of prose pacing just cannot be over-exaggerated. It cannot be overemphasized because she is so skilled at pulling the reader forward, which is one of the reasons that these books are just so readable. It's so easy to start reading Harry Potter and so difficult to stop because she suspends the reader's engagement, the reader's belief with a masterful touch. I'm thinking in particular there of the passage that begins, Harry's stomach lurched. So, okay, we get the it is an omen, the worst omen of death from Professor Trelawney. And then we get Harry's stomach lurched, short, punchy sentence, drags us into the next paragraph. That dog on the cover of Death Omens and Flourish and Blots. Sentence fragment. We're not actually getting anything of meaning here. We don't have an active verb. That dog on the cover of Death Omens and Flourish and Blots. M dash. The dog in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent. Ellipsis. Lavender Brown clapped her hands to her mouth too. So we're externalizing Harry's reaction here to Lavender, which is so great. This is such a strong thing to do when we're deep in Harry's POV. His stomach lurched, so we know that we are effectively, narratively speaking, inside Harry's head at this point because we're feeling what he's feeling right now. But then we masterfully control the reader's engagement and pull back out again. Lavender Brown clapped her hands to her mouth too. Everyone was looking at Harry, so we're kind of objectifying Harry from the perspective of the room. Everyone except Hermione, who'd gotten up and moved around to the back of Professor Trelawney's chair. I don't think it looks like a Grim, she says flatly, undercutting the kind of the import here of the proclamation, this grim omen of death, if you'll forgive the pun there on Grim. But of course, not everyone at Hogwarts is as receptive to the divinatory arts as Professor Trelawney. Oh, this is interesting. Before I push on here, Trelawney and Voldemort, says Joseph, shared view that death is the worst thing that there is? That's very interesting, isn't it? I guess it all depends on how you parse that sentence, doesn't it? The giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards. My dear boy, it is an omen, the worst omen of death. Now, the worst omen there, is that interrupting a previous thought? Is that interrupting an existing phrase? My dear boy, it is an omen of death, the worst omen? Or is she saying it is an omen, comma, the worst omen, comma, an omen of death? Is she saying that this is the worst omen of death, or that an omen of death is the worst kind of omen, or arguably both? That's a really interesting thought. Yeah. Good. Good. Huh. I'm going to be thinking about that. Thank you, Joseph. I appreciate that thought. Okay, let's push on to the counter position, I suppose, and of course the brilliant Professor McGonagall. Really, what has gotten into you all today? Said Professor McGonagall, turning back into herself with a faint pop and staring around at them all. Not that it matters, but that's the first time my transformation's not got applause from a class. Everybody's heads turned toward Harry again, but nobody spoke. Then Hermione raised her hand. Please, Professor, we just had our first divination class, and we were reading the tea leaves and... of course, said Professor McGonagall, suddenly frowning. There's no need to say any more, Miss Granger. Tell me, which of you will be dying this year? Everyone stared at her. Me, said Harry, finally. I see, said Professor McGonagall, fixing Harry with her beady eyes. Then you should know, Potter, that Sybil Trelawney has predicted the death of one student a year since she arrived at the school. None of them has died yet. Seeing death omens is her favourite way of greeting a new class, if it were not for the fact that I never speak ill of my colleagues. Professor McGonagall broke off, and they saw that her nostrils had gone white. She went on more calmly. Divination is one of the most imprecise branches of magic. I shall not conceal from you that I have very little patience with it. True seers are very rare, and Professor Trelawney... She stopped again, and then said in a very matter-of-fact tone, You look in excellent health to me, Potter, so you will excuse me if I do not let you off homework today. I assure you that if you die, you need not hand it in. Rob Glass anticipates my comment perfectly by saying, I feel like the beginning of the slide is one of the first times we've seen a truly human McGonagall. Yes, I completely agree. The idea of McGonagall transforming back into herself and then saying, what? No applause? No applause for that? Did you see what I just did? That is, you're right, Rob, completely human. I just love it. And even then, the beat here that she is losing her temper, or that she is at least struggling to maintain control of her temper, and we get that specifically in the nostrils going white, that she is exhibiting such self-control here that her nostrils are going white and covering it perfectly. They saw that her nostrils had gone white. She went on more calmly. Divination is one of the more imprecise branches of magic. She's not expressing this, or is at least struggling not to express this. This is far and away the most complex McGonagall that we've been given to date, and absolutely cements her as one of my favorite characters in the entire book. But much more importantly, we get the counterpoint here, that divination is imprecise. True seers are very rare, she concedes. No, there are people out there who can see the future, but Sybil Trelawney is not one of them, by implication at least, or is at least, I suppose, potentially inconsistently one of them, if we give this the most generous read that we possibly can. And then she does what McGonagall does, which is offer a very human reassurance. You look in excellent health to me. You'll excuse me if I don't let you off homework today. This is exactly what a good leader, what a good instructor, what a good, mother figure within the bounds of Hogwarts should do. I absolutely love that. I absolutely love it. Rob says this may also be the first time we're seeing her tell a joke too. Yes, I think so. I mean, an outright joke. Yes, she's always had a bit of kind of waspish acidity to her. We've seen something approaching sarcasm from McGonagall before, but yes, I think this is the first time that she is clearly intending a joke, and also, as we say, bookending this particular slide. She's making a wry observation that's borderline a joke right at the beginning, and then making something that is much more clearly a joke, intended to elicit a humorous and emotional response right there at the end. Yeah, good. Let me see if I'm missing anything in the YouTube chat. No, we're looking. The love of Minerva McGonagall makes my heart happy. It's so good. Yes. Yeah, and we can wonder too here. Yeah, Rahit also called this out. I feel like this is the first time since the first chapter of Sorcerer's Stone that we see McGonagall as human. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Yes. And there, of course, she's much more reactive. It's a much more kind of crisis-driven, emotional kind of response there. Yes, that's good. Excellent. Okay. McGonagall is the Hermione of the Dumbledore power trio, right? Asks QueenCon14. So her reaction and Hermione's are similar? Yes. Absolutely. McGonagall is to Hermione as Hagrid is to Ron, as Dumbledore is to Harry. The McGonagall, Hagrid, Dumbledore power trio that we see right at the beginning of Sorcerer's Stone and only in fragmentary form since then, is every bit as powerful as the Harry, Ron, Hermione power trio. As I say, we can see that structure replicated up and down this series. It's all over the place. Back in Chamber of Secrets, we had our Hufflepuff power trio. Even, I think, I did see some speculation that that Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle can also be seen as a power trio. I don't think that we get enough from Crabbe and Goyle to be absolutely sure that that is the case, but certainly it is of note that Malfoy is flanked by 2 associates just in the same way as Harry is. Yes, I kind of like that idea too, but yes, good. Let me see here. Good. Okay, I think we're all up to date. Yes, Ramya says for all her derision toward Trelawney, McGonagall will stand up for her in Order of the Phoenix. I love her. McGonagall's professionalism here is just great. Courtney is joining us live from Houston, which for those of you watching live or in the very near future is startling. Courtney, I hope you're doing well. Courtney says her joke and sass reminds me of Harry when he's sassy. Yes, it's that mother figure thing. I think there's a lot of McGonagall in Harry, which is perhaps the nicest thing that you can say about someone. Sarah says it's possible that if McGonagall ever did ask Dumbledore about it, he would have said he had his reasons for hiring her and keeping up the class, and McGonagall would have taken that at face value. Well, the idea that true seers are rare, but by implication possible, I think kind of validates the existence of the school of divination, the department of divination, I suppose, in Hogwarts. But yes, I'm certain, absolutely certain that McGonagall kind of cedes the control of the school to Dumbledore and trusts him. Absolutely, yes. I think that's completely fair. Good. So let's move on from McGonagall's class to Hagrid's class. This is our first day with Hagrid as the new professor here at Hogwarts. Hippogriffs! Hagrid roared happily, waving a hand at them. Beautiful, aren't they? Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once you got over the first shock of seeing something that was half horse, half bird, you started to appreciate the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feather to hair, each of them a different color, stormy gray, bronze, pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black. So, said Hagrid, rubbing his hands together and beaming around, if you want to come a bit nearer. No one seemed to want to. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, approached the fence cautiously. Now, first thing you got to know about hippogriffs is they're proud, said Hagrid. Easily offended hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, because it might be the last thing you do. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting how best to disrupt the lesson. You always wait for the hippogriff to make the first move, Hagrid continued. It's polite, see? You walk toward him and you bow and you wait. If he bows back, you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, then get away from him sharpish, because those talons hurt. Jamie says, I would absolutely question Dumbledore's judgment with staff judgments. Quirrell, Lockhart, fair. I mean, we're supposed to think that Dumbledore was taken in by Lockhart, which... I mean, Quirrell at least seems to have been a decent appointment, if not for the influence of Voldemort, right? Like, Quirrell could potentially at least have been a decent Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. Maybe, possibly. Lockhart is more difficult because, Dumbledore would have to have been at least in part taken in by his whole performance, but then apparently everyone was. Yeah. Sarah says, Hagrid's class makes me cringe so much. Oh man, I know he just wants to do a good job. Yeah, he wants to do a good job, but yeah, not great. But we are going to see the evolution of Hagrid, at least within this book. Ultimately, of course, Hagrid is going to be somewhat sidelined by the developing narrative through the rest of the series, but yeah. Sarah says Lockhart had to be hired. Nobody else was applying, right? I believe that's true, but surely someone from somewhere, surely Dumbledore could have gone to the ministry and said, hey, we don't have a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. How about you pull some strings, get us someone from, I don't know, one of the many other wizarding schools, which definitely exist when we're talking about Chamber of Secrets. Lockhart's got to be the reaction to Quirrell, says Zygmorphix. Oops, the last one was evil. This one will be harmless. I mean, sure, Evil dada me once, shame on me. Shame on you, I suppose. Evil dada me twice, shame on me. Yes. Okay. Good. All right. So Hagrid teaching here, and we see what it is that separates Hagrid from the other professors, but also what it is that identifies Hagrid with Ron. It's his enthusiasm. It's his passion. It's his enormous heart and capability to connect with these creatures, the creatures in his care, but also to try to connect to these students. Hagrid should be keeping an eye on Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle. He should be anticipating disruption of his class, but he just doesn't think that way. He doesn't feel that way, which of course leads to terrible events. Yeah. As Hero of Time says, yes, in the YouTube chat, hippogriffs definitely seem to fit Hagrid's ideal of a magical creature. He wants to dazzle them as he is dazzled. Yes, absolutely. And the fact that they are proud, the fact that they have this sentience, the fact that they respond to courtesy and the rules of civility, Hagrid must be moved by that. You know, there is a reason that Hagrid looks up, for all that Hagrid is an outlier, for all that Hagrid is, you know, all but a hermit living out here on the fringes of the Hogwarts campus, for all that he is kind of antithetical to our notion of a good wizard, let alone a good professor at Hogwarts, particularly within the frame of that formal instruction of magic that we've been discussing over the last few weeks, Hagrid's hero is Albus Dumbledore. That relationship has to be forged from a kind of a primary loyalty, which of course would be true of Hagrid. If Hagrid weren't in Gryffindor, he would be a Hufflepuff, just as Ron would be a Hufflepuff. But we see here a deep respect from Hagrid for Dumbledore and the kind of structures of civility, the structures of school and life and the adult world. It is a personal loyalty, yes, but I get the sense that it is also a kind of civil loyalty here. Hagrid wants to be a good Hagrid. He wants to be the best Hagrid that he can be. Yes. Jamie says, is this a failing of Dumbledore's? Should he maybe have provided Hagrid with some student teaching before giving him a class of his own? Hagrid knows the subject well, but teaching is its own skill. That I think is fair. Yes. But of course, we don't want to anticipate that. I mean, you're right in a sense. The answer to that is yes, but then there wouldn't have been a narrative beat here. Then Hagrid would just have been good at this and we wouldn't have been able to arc him through it. How good a headmaster is Albus Dumbledore? Well, he's a good headmaster of people, but perhaps not a good headmaster of the institution. Yes. Let's talk a little about hippogriffs, because hippogriffs are fascinating. If you grew up as I grew up, you know, reading voraciously the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, then you'll be familiar with hippogriffs, or you know, Greek myth in particular is very fond of the hippogriff. But hippogriffs are actually a derivative creature themselves. Hippogriffs emerged from griffins. Griffins are one of the oldest kind of archetypal mythic creatures that we have in myth, in any myth. Griffins are attested in multiple mythic traditions from the year like 3000 BC. They are old. They're basically as old as recorded myths. Griffins, to kind of differentiate the two, have the body, the tail, and the back legs of a lion, and the head and the wings of an eagle. The eagle's talons function as the front feet. So, you know, first third eagle, I suppose, plus wings, back 2/3 lion body, which is appropriate because the lion is the most, you know, majestic of the land animals and the eagle is the most majestic of the air animals. Thus, it is the perfect kind of hybrid of the two. The hippogriff descends from the griffin, and we know that this is absolutely true because hippogriffs, mythically speaking, are the product of a stallion, a horse, and a griffin. So this is what happens when you find yourself with a very brave horse, basically, is what we've got. Hey, here's a creature which is half eagle, half lion, and one horse that's like, hey, how you doing? And you end up with a hippogriff. Hippogriffs are attested from around 40 BC. The first recording that we have of hippogriffs comes to us from Virgil's Bucolics, but they were really formalized kind of in the late medieval period. They are around in Greek myth, but they become a kind of standard fairy tale trope leading into a standard fantasy trope around the late Middle Ages and into the kind of development of formalized fairy tale traditions in Western Europe. Yeah. Rami, this is interesting. Rami says, as an American kid reading these books, I didn't realize how rooted these novels were in European lore and myth. It made things magical and otherworldly at the time, but now I love finding out these aspects. I'm so glad. That's so great to discover a whole hidden layer here underneath them. That's wonderful. Good. Jamie says, yes, as soon as I read this, I thought of griffins. Yeah, very closely connected. Raina says, maybe Hagrid doesn't realize how dangerous Buckbeak is because they're the same size, which I like quite a lot. But he is certainly he is certainly communicating the danger of Buckbeak at this point, the danger of hippogriffs in general. So he's trying to impart some sense of caution, and always, of course, trying to impart some sense of respect, right? This is one of the other connections here. Hagrid's respect for Buckbeak is not entirely dissimilar to Ron's respect for Scabbers. Scabbers is, you know, a pretty weak sauce familiar, you know, a pretty weak sauce wizardy pet. But nonetheless, Ron has not just an affection, but a respect, and that's key. Okay, let's skip ahead to the end of this chapter. I'm still only one chapter in, you guys. This is going to be a ragged dash here through chapters 7 and 8. Obviously, the Hippogriff Buckbeak attacks on provocation Draco Malfoy, who then proceeds to play up the incident horribly because God Slytherin, you guys, the worst. Then our power trio go to visit Hagrid and kind of restore him to some semblance of normality, if normality is yelling in all caps at Harry, which I think for Hagrid it probably is. I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid, said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it. Oh, maybe she's right, said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair and followed Hermione unsteadily outside. They heard a loud splash. What's he done? Said Harry nervously as Hermione came back in with an empty tankard. Stuck his head in the water barrel, said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long hair and beard sopping wet, wiping the water out of his eyes. That's better, he said, shaking his head like a dog and drenching them all. Listen, it were good of you to come and see me. I really... Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as though he'd only just realized he was there. What do you think you're doing, eh? He roared so suddenly that they jumped a foot in the air. You're not to go wandering around after dark, Harry. And you two, letting him. Hagrid strode over to Harry, grabbed his arm and pulled him to the door. Come on, Hagrid said angrily. I'm taking you all the way back up to the school, and don't let me catch you walking around here to see me after dark again. I'm not worth it. The humanity of Hagrid here, the kind of the wound that Hagrid has suffered, the wound of his, you know, partly professional reputation, partly the dereliction of his duty to these students, partly, and most importantly, the betrayal of Dumbledore's trust. This cuts Hagrid deeply. It cuts him to the quick, as a similar injury would cut Ron. And again, we're seeing here Hermione deciding that Hagrid has had enough to drink, taking the tankard outside, dumping it out, coming back in, and then putting it away. Yes, of course, we're seeing foreshadowing here, and not just foreshadowing, but we're seeing echoes here of Hermione's relationship with Ron. It's a really powerful thing. And of course, we're foreshadowing the danger of Sirius Black. This is Hagrid acting, well, actually very much in character, but to the power trio, from the perspective of our heroes, he seems to be acting wildly out of character, losing his temper like this, grabbing Harry's arm and pulling him to the door. That's not Hagrid. Something here is terribly, terribly wrong. Elizabeth says in the YouTube chat, making a point that I think will be all the more urgent and bothersome as we progress through the series. Another example of the trio being the adults and Hagrid needing parenting. I love Hagrid, but he's not always good for them. Glad he snapped out of it. Very good. Yes, I'm inclined to agree. Rob says, Harry is forcing quite a few people to transition to acting like fathers and authoritative adults after Dumbledore, Arthur, and now Hagrid. That's an excellent point. To what degree does Arthur Weasley act like an adult, like a father to Harry in a way that he wouldn't act to other children? Arthur Weasley is the father. Arthur Weasley is the ultimate dad. He should have a t-shirt that just says ultimate dad on it. I think that Arthur Weasley is as elementally, as atomically a father as it is pretty much possible to be. So I'm not sure about Harry kind of forcing him in that direction, but certainly it is an opportunity for Arthur to engage his most virtuous faculties. Yes, but certainly, yeah, we're seeing the number of people who are willing to step into that gulf, to step into that vacuum and fill a parental role for Harry is actually, I think, laudable. Yeah, that's a good catch. Yes. Courtney says, between the comparison of Hagrid to a dog and then Hagrid himself saying he isn't worth it, shows some deep beliefs in the wizarding world. Yes, I'm a little troubled by that too. I'm a little troubled by I'm not worth that. Though it is that I think that maybe redeems it. I'm taking you all back up to the school. Don't let me catch you walking down here to see me after dark again. I'm not worth that. Like, specifically that. It's not that I am worthless. It's not that Hagrid is kind of de-emphasizing his own humanity, presence here. It's that he's specifically saying, I am not worth that. But you're right, a casual read at least is suggestive of that. And I wonder how Harry and Ron and Hermione take that. Yeah. Good. I think Hagrid was crushed by his experience of being bullied and judged, says Mari. That's very good. He was blamed for murder. It would be hard to come back from that. The only world that could ever accept him fully rejected him, though he has forged his own niche, right? He had carved his own niche, I suppose, so as to not mix the metaphor there. He has made a place that is his, and he seems genuinely to be happy there. Of course, we must remember how he swells with pride when he is appointed a professor at Hogwarts. May not be the best step from Dumbledore, but this is where we are nonetheless. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move on into Chapter 7 and the sighting of Sirius Black. Hey, Harry, said Seamus Finnegan, leaning over to borrow Harry's brass scales. Have you heard? Daily Prophet this morning. They reckon Sirius Black's been sighted. Where? Said Harry and Ron quickly. On the other side of the table, Malfoy looked up, listening closely. Not too far from here, said Seamus, who looked excited. It was a muggle who saw him. Of course, she didn't really understand. The muggles think he's just an ordinary criminal, don't they? So she phoned the telephone hotline. By the time the Ministry of Magic got there, he was gone. Not too far from here, Ron repeated, looking significantly at Harry. He turned around and saw Malfoy watching closely. What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned? But Malfoy's eyes were shining malevolently and they were fixed on Harry. He leaned across the table. Thinking of trying to catch Black single-handed, Potter? Yeah, that's right, said Harry offhandedly. Malfoy's thin mouth was curving in a mean smile. Of course, if it was me, he said quietly, I'd have done something before now. I wouldn't be staying in school like a good boy. I'd be out there looking for him. What are you talking about, Malfoy? Said Ron roughly. Don't you know, Potter? Breathed Malfoy, his pale eyes narrowed. Know what? Malfoy let out a low, sneering laugh. Maybe you'd rather not risk your neck, he said. Want to leave it to the Dementors, do you? But if it was me, I'd want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself. Another beat here with Sirius Black. Another plank here in our bridge to the truth, I suppose. Another point of speculation, a point of suspicion here about Sirius Black. We're leaning again and again on the idea that there is a more personal connection, a more powerful connection between Harry and Sirius Black. Not just a historical connection. As I've said, there are metaphorical connections between, kind of reflective connections between Harry and Sirius throughout the book. We're getting Harry's imprisonment, Harry's escape from the Dursleys right at the beginning. If we cast Vernon Petunia in the role of Dementors here, which perhaps isn't entirely inappropriate, Harry's escape from the Dursleys, escape from Privet Drive, absolutely connects to Sirius's escape from Azkaban. Both have been liberated, minor spoilers, after something of a long injustice. Both have been liberated into the wizarding world again, and both are now free to take action, but neither of them is entirely free because they both have fame. They both have a certain kind of celebrity. Now, Harry's celebrity generally more positive, though we've seen before how that can turn. Sirius, of course, notorious. He is infamous here. This is an ongoing echo that will finally be resolved right toward the end of the book. But here, Malfoy's manipulation. And Malfoy, again, as we talked about last time, and I think even the week before, Malfoy leaning in here to the idea that Harry is the hero. Well, you should go after him. I would go after him if I were you. I wouldn't be a good boy and abide by the rules. What? Did they take away your hero card, Harry? Who are you, even if you're not going after Sirius Black? What the hell? This is playing into this idea that Harry's very exceptionalism, this fundamental exceptionalism, the fact that he is the boy who lived, the fact that he is the most famous wizard in the world right now, that this drives him to take action. We saw Arthur do this before, and we saw Hermione echo that thought, and now we have our 3-beat, because now we have that same understanding being turned to malevolent purpose. Arthur warns Harry not to go after Sirius because he understands who Harry is. Also, details of the backstory, but he understands who Harry is. Hermione warns Harry not to go looking for trouble because she understands who Harry is. And now Draco Malfoy is goading Harry into going looking for trouble because he, too, understands who Harry is. This is perhaps the most interesting and certainly most threatening scene that we've had with Draco Malfoy to date. I mean, the use of the word mudblood shocking and is, you know, rank and offensive. But this is the kind of manipulation of which, you know, Salazar Slytherin would be proud. I think this is very proficient here. He understands the danger, he understands the connection, and he is goading Draco. He is goading Harry right now. Yeah. As Saved Girl 309 says in the YouTube chat, Malfoy gets Harry. He knows what buttons to press, egging on Harry's heroic impulses like that. That's absolutely right. Yes. Good. Good. All right. We're going to take a quick break now from the main action to look at a minor subplot. I'm not going to have the opportunity really to talk about the Time Turner subplot, but I want to call out this slide just to look at how good it is and how proficiently, how skillfully J.K. Rowling weaves the Time Turner subplot through the rest of the book. I know even saying Time Turner is a spoiler, but by this point we're absolutely primed to discern that something is going on. The book is highlighting Hermione's odd disappearances and reappearances, and we're getting to the point where now we understand something is awry, but we're not sure what. Hermione was panting slightly, hurrying up the stairs. One hand clutched her bag, the other seemed to be tucking something down the front of her robes. "How'd you do that?" said Ron. "What?" said Hermione, joining them. "One minute you're right behind us, the next moment you're back at the bottom of the stairs again." "What?" Hermione looked slightly confused. "Oh, I had to go back for something." "Oh, no." A seam had split on Hermione's bag. Harry wasn't surprised. He could see that it was crammed with at least a dozen large and heavy books. "Why are you carrying all those around with you?" Ron asked her. "You know how many subjects I'm taking," said Hermione breathlessly. "Couldn't hold these for me, could you?" "But—" Ron was turning over the books she had handed him, looking at the covers. "You haven't got any of these subjects today. It's only Defense Against the Dark Arts this afternoon." "Oh, yes," said Hermione vaguely, but she packed all the books back into her bag just the same. "I hope there's something good for lunch. I'm starving," she added, and she marched off toward the Great Hall. "Do you get the feeling Hermione's not telling us something?" Ron asked Harry. It's so skillfully done, so beautifully foreshadowed. I love the way that this is built. I love the way that we get this interaction. I love Ron's concern for her. Like, it's a skeptical concern. He thinks that she's hiding something. He suspects that she's getting away with something, and he wants to know what it is out of curiosity. But he also seems to be somewhat defensive of her. There's no real reason for him to oppose her carrying all of these heavy books around, except, "I don't want you to be carrying all these heavy books around. Why are you doing this?" And Hermione is evasive, and we're getting these hints dropped in again and again that she's not experiencing the school year at Hogwarts in quite the same way as the other kids. Yeah. I love the Time Turner plotline in this book, Jamie says, and then you realize how much this screws up everything. Why didn't someone use this to kill young Tom Riddle? The turning of the Time Turner is problematic. The amount of time that it would take to turn the Time Turner so that you could go back a significant period of time would be prohibitive. You would be literally standing there turning the Time Turner for days or weeks or months in order to travel back a significant period of time. But the greater point, yes, absolutely. Because it's not about the Time Turner specifically. The Time Turner is one instantiation of time travel magic in the world of Harry Potter. And if it's possible this way, then everything that we know about magic in Harry Potter suggests that it is possible other ways too. Someone would inevitably build a better Time Turner. And that does, as you say, unpick the entire, fabric of our understanding of the wizarding world. Why does anything bad happen when time travel magic exists? You have to kind of invoke Doctor Who style fixed points in time and kind of non-intervention clauses in order to make this work. This is the paradox of introducing time travel into your story. Though, I think the greatest problem with the Time Turner, God, I don't know why I'm getting into this now. We should talk about this when the whole plot is revealed. The greatest problem with the Time Turner is the origin of the Time Turner. If Hermione just found it, if this was a kind of magic that was not supposed to be used, if this was not sanctioned magic, then we'd be dealing with a different circumstance. But we're not. We'll deal with it. Yeah. Okay, let's keep pushing on because, as I say, so much to do. And we've got to get to our first Defense Against the Dark Arts class and Professor Lupin and the Boggart. So the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a Boggart? Hermione put up her hand. "It's a shapeshifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us most." "Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. "So the Boggart, sitting in the darkness within, has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone, but when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears. This means, said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, that we have a huge advantage over the boggart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry? Trying to answer a question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air, was very off-putting. But Harry had a go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should be. Precisely, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a boggart. He becomes confused. What should he become, a headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a boggart make that very mistake, tried to frighten 2 people at once and turned himself into half a slug. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a boggart is simple, yet it requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes a boggart is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous! And so we expand upon one of the fundamental themes of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Fear. The fear of fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of malevolence, yes. And evil, yes. And wickedness, yes. And pain and violence and bloodshed, yes. But really, the fear of fear, as embodied by Harry. The response to the boggart, I should say that boggarts here, this is actually an Old English term. This is not a word that J.K. Rowling created, though if you Google it, you would think that it was. Boggarts come from the same kind of etymological school as bugbears and bogeymen and boogeymen and bogles and in Scotland, bogles. They're all kind of drawn back to the Old English word bug, meaning, you know, something kind of insignificant but malevolent, you know, like a sprite kind of thing. They are all of those forms that I just described are kind of household disembodied spirits, mischievous spirits. Oftentimes it's things disappear, the milk goes sour, the cow falls down. It's kind of harmless household stuff, but the manifestation of fear specifically is kind of a Victorian addition to that myth, the kind of the physical apparition of this thing. Generally speaking, they were just more like nuisance household spirits prior to that. So the boggart here, absolutely, again, in that kind of European mythic tradition. So let's take a look at the response to a boggart. The charm that repels a boggart is simple, yet it requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes a boggart is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. Force of mind is a really interesting and curious phrase, because when we go through the rest of the scene and we see children confronting the boggart and transforming it into ridiculous things, if you like, what we see them demonstrating there is force of mind, but it's force of mind in a much more kind of familiar and prosaic form. They demonstrate courage. And this got me thinking about the role of courage in the opposition to fear, how we face down fear with the courage here not to battle or to overcome, but crucially to subvert. And it seems to me that there is something very Slytherin about the subversion of the boggart's nature, the transformation of the boggart into something laughable that disempowers it. That is manipulative in a very Slytherin kind of way. The Gryffindor solution to a boggart problem is a sword. Of course, the Gryffindor solution to many, many problems is a sword. But here, for the first time, we're getting a perspective on defense against the dark arts that is more sophisticated than hit it with something bigger or cast the appropriate counterspell or the appropriate counter charm. Also note that this is a charm. It's difficult / nigh on impossible to really properly break down the taxonomy of magic in the Harry Potter series. But here we get a charm that is simple, and we're going to practice it without wands. So we're not casting it, and yet it does seem to carry some power. This is just the verbal component here. It does seem to carry some power. This whole thing is fascinating. I see a lot of you here from the in the YouTube chat here celebrating this scene and saying that it's your favorite in the series. I completely agree. Yes. And yeah, of course, the series of boggarts that we see, or the series not of boggarts, but the series of nightmarish visions that we see and the ways in which those are subverted, just great, just fantastic. From there, we'll take a moment to note Harry's fear. Yeah. Oh, Quincom14 says, correction, Mad-Eye Moody knows what it looks like in its original form. Interesting. I'd forgotten that. That's very good. Yes, yes. Good. Can't wait to talk about Mad-Eye Moody, you guys. Okay. The room went quiet. Harry thought, what scared him most in the world? His first thought was Lord Voldemort. A Voldemort returned to full strength. But before he'd even started to plan a possible counterattack on a Boggart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hand, slithering back beneath a black cloak. A long, rattling breath from an unseen mouth. Then a cold, so penetrating it felt like drowning. Harry shivered, then looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Ron was muttering to himself, take its legs off. Harry was sure he knew what that was about. Ron's greatest fear was spiders. Let me see in the YouTube chat. Rob says it's creating courage so that even if there's a fear that the spell won't work, you can build your confidence about it, which will make it work. That's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy right there. Yes, yes. Raina says, Alistair, what would be your Boggart important cue? The little icon that I get on my computer or my phone, the Wi-Fi symbol with a little X next to it telling me that I'm not connected. Does that count? I don't know. What am I phobic of? I guess my fears are little flying insects that sting, honestly. Flying insects that sting bother me more than most things. And not even like bees. Bumblebees are just completely fine. I'm not, freaked out by them. But wasps are vicious. So maybe wasps, maybe like a giant wasp. It could be that. Yeah. Probably now Lord Voldemort returned to full power now that this book has put that idea in my head. So, thanks for that. Angela asks, why doesn't Lupin allow Hermione to practice on the Boggart? I kind of agree with this, with his reason for Harry, but Hermione, well, yeah, it isn't clear that he allows every child to face the Boggart. In fact, it is pretty clear that he doesn't, because he hands out points afterward for every child that faced the Boggart, which I appreciate. My guess here is probably that Rowling just didn't want to pin down Hermione's worst fear. She doesn't need to at this point. The Boggart has been adequately demonstrated, so Hermione doesn't need to be pulled into it too, because we've got Ron to fulfill that role for the power trio. But yeah. Oh, this is interesting. Jamie says it's interesting that Harry takes so much time to figure out what his fear is, whereas others seem to know right away. And if you don't actually know what your true fear is, does the Boggart? That's interesting, right? If Harry had come upon a Boggart without any kind of preparation, would the Boggart first of all have assumed the form of Voldemort and then morphed into a Dementor? Possibly. But here again, we're going to call this out specifically in Gildart's Winter says, oh, now I know, a naked woman will be mine pregnancy. Kidding. We're going to foreshadow here the conversation that Harry has with Lupin, but the idea that fear itself, the fear of the Dementors, the fear of the Dementors' fear is powerful. And again, notice how Rowling manipulates the pacing here. A rotting, glistening hand slithering back beneath a black cloak, ellipsis. A long rattling breath from an unseen mouth, ellipsis. A cold so penetrating it felt like drowning. Again, all of that water imagery that we were discussing earlier. Yeah, good. All right. Let's move into chapter 8. And we're going to begin chapter 8 with kind of just a brief gloss of what's happening at Hogwarts. Very early in chapter 8, we skip ahead to the beginning of October. And by the time we hit anything really serious in chapter 8, we're going to be on Halloween. So we've cut right the way to the end of October. And this, as I say, is a product of J.K. Rowling's conceit that each of these books should map to the school year, which leaves us with a lot of dead time. It leaves us with a lot of padding. There's just a lot kind of happening, and then we will lead entire passages of time. We get the beat here about Quidditch, which isn't really. I love it. I mean, I love Wood. I think he's a great character, and his enthusiasm for winning the cup this year is really, really great. But we're just kind of burning time so that we can get there. But it is worth noting that almost 2 months passed between Harry's encounter with the Boggart, such as it was, and his conversation with Lupin. But before we get to that, we're going to get to the Hogsmeade trip and Harry's conversation with McGonagall. Harry only wished he was as happy with some of his other classes. Worst of all was potions. Oh wait, this is the extra slide that I had. I do apologize. I had an extra slide here as we move in. I just kind of discussed this. Let's move on to Professor McGonagall. Harry waited for the rest of the class to disappear, then headed nervously for Professor McGonagall's desk. Yes, Potter. Harry took a deep breath. Professor, my aunt and uncle, forgot to sign my form, he said. Professor McGonagall looked over her square spectacles at him, but didn't say anything. So, do you think it'd be all right? I mean, will it be okay if I go to Hogsmeade? Professor McGonagall looked down and began shuffling papers on her desk. I'm afraid not, Potter, she said. You heard what I said. No forum, no visiting the village. That's the rule. But, Professor, my aunt and uncle, they're muggles. They don't really understand about Hogwarts forms and stuff, Harry said, while Ron egged him on with vigorous nods. If you said I could go, but I don't say so, said Professor McGonagall, standing up and piling her papers neatly into a drawer. The forum clearly states that the parent or guardian must give permission. She turned to look at him with an odd expression on her face. Was it pity? I'm sorry, Potter, but that's my final word. You'd better hurry or you'll be late for your next lesson. This is the flip side of the earlier scene that we had with Minerva McGonagall. Here she is still the mother figure for Harry, but now she is the stern mother figure. No, the rules are the rules. And it is, of course, pity that Harry sees in her face. It is, of course, pity that she is feeling as she looks down and begins shuffling papers on her desk. She knows what's coming. She knows what she has to do. She knows that it is unjust, and she knows that Harry is going to suffer for it. But the rules are the rules. As Rahit says, God, I love this scene. It exposes McGonagall's genuine affection for Harry. It's so subtle but strong. Yes, I completely agree. So Harry is not going to go to Hogsmeade. And this, of course, is a necessary narrative construction here. It's vital in order to drive forward the action, but it is also crucially and beautifully human. Even here in Hogwarts, Harry's being screwed over. He is being done a disservice by the muggles who have defined his life. He isn't just suffering because of the Dursleys over the summer holidays. He's suffering because of the Dursleys in the here and now. The muggle influence is reaching into Hogwarts itself, and that too is an inversion of what we saw previously in the first two books. As I've said before, previously the muggle world was dominant and the wizard world sequestered. And now we've inverted that. But the power of the sequestered world, the power of the smaller, inferior world, is that it can pervade. It can influence. And the influence here of the muggle world on Harry's magical experience is pernicious. As Becca Eller says, McGonagall loves him so much, and I love it. Yes. Good. Well, Courtney raises an interesting point. I wonder if she would have said yes and signed his form if it wasn't for Sirius Black. And it is possible to read this as, okay, if we are cued to believe that Minerva McGonagall will bend the rules for Harry, which, yeah, we're kind of cued to believe that, then this may be another indication that the Sirius Black situation is dire, right? But two things. The first is that the alternative to sending Harry off with the other kids to Hogsmeade is having Harry hang out at Hogwarts all by himself. And Sirius Black or no Sirius Black, that seems like an invitation to trouble. That seems like something that is probably going to end badly, which leads me to believe that Minerva McGonagall is, in fact, just observing the rules here. It's possible, though both interpretations, absolutely valid. Yeah, absolutely valid. All right. Let's keep going. We still have, 3 more slides in 10 minutes? We can do that. This is easy. This is a piece of cake, particularly when I forgot that one slide that I added, but never mind. It's all good. Harry explores the school and finally winds up with the wonderful Professor Lupin. Sit down, said Lupin, taking the lid off a dusty tin. I've only got tea bags, I'm afraid, but I dare say you've had enough of tea leaves. Harry looked at him. Lupin's eyes were twinkling. How did you know about that? Harry asked. Professor McGonagall told me, said Lupin, passing Harry a chipped mug of tea. You're not worried, are you? No, said Harry. He thought for a moment of telling Lupin about the dog he'd seen in Magnolia Crescent, but decided not to. He didn't want Lupin to think he was a coward, especially since Lupin already seemed to think he couldn't cope with a Boggart. Something of Harry's thoughts seemed to have shown on his face because Lupin said, Anything worrying you, Harry? No, Harry lied. He drank a bit of tea and watched the Grindylow banishing a I can't pronounce words now, even made-up words, and watched the Grindylow brandishing a fist at him. Yes, he said suddenly, putting his tea down on Lupin's desk. You know that day we fought the Boggart? Yes, said Lupin slowly. Why didn't you let me fight it? Said Harry abruptly. Lupin raised his eyebrows. I would have thought that was obvious, Harry, he said, sounding surprised. Harry, who had expected Lupin to deny that he had done any such thing, was taken aback. Why? He said again. Well, said Lupin, frowning slightly, I assumed that if the Boggart faced you, it would assume the shape of Lord Voldemort. Lupin's direct honesty with Harry, Lupin's ability to puncture some of the pomposity of Hogwarts. Pomposity is perhaps the wrong word. I'm thinking of Sybil Trelawney, but some of the mystery, some of the mysticism of Hogwarts is notable. Come and have a cup of tea. It's tea bags. It's fine. Are tea bags a Muggle invention, by the way? Is Lupin kind of slightly bending the rules here? Do wizards use tea bags? I'm fascinated by that. That may not be of significant interest to anyone who isn't British and hasn't kind of navigated the etiquette of tea, the proper tea-giving etiquette. But all of these details suggest that Lupin is very down to earth. He's teasing Harry, the twinkling eyes, the chipped mug, and his ability to read Harry, something bothering you, and then his honesty. And even, as we call it specifically on the next slide, his naming of Voldemort. Harry stared. Not only was this the last answer he'd expected, but Lupin had said Voldemort's name. The only person Harry had ever heard say that name aloud, apart from himself, was Professor Dumbledore. Clearly, I was wrong, said Lupin, still frowning at Harry. But I didn't think it a good idea for Lord Voldemort to materialize in the staff room. I imagined that people would panic. I didn't think of Voldemort, said Harry, honestly. I remembered those Dementors. I see, said Lupin thoughtfully. Oh, well, I'm impressed. He smiled slightly at the look of surprise on Harry's face. That suggests that what you fear most of all is fear. Very wise, Harry. Harry didn't know what to say to that, so he drank some more tea. The fear of fear, as I suggested earlier, is one of the most important themes of this entire book. The power of the Dementors is exaggerated because they spread fear and doubt. The power of Voldemort, the power of he who must not be named, it is no coincidence that Lupin here, when we're talking about fear, when we're talking about the fear of the unknown, when we're talking about the fear of fear itself, it is no coincidence that Professor Lupin names Voldemort precisely, coldly, mechanically. Because this he who must not be named, the you-know-who business, this only empowers the mystery of Voldemort. It only empowers the reputation, the myth of Voldemort, and thus lends him more power. We reduce those things of which we are afraid by mocking them, certainly. That's true in the case of the Boggart. But we also reduce those things of which we are afraid by understanding them, by comprehending them, by naming them. Because to name something is to express a quality of understanding. To say he who must not be named is to attribute to Voldemort an unknowable, unfathomable power. It is the power of all things unknown, all things unstated. He becomes the gap between the word. He is everything that we cannot express. But when we call him Voldemort, then he becomes precise. He becomes fixed. This, of course, echoes the oldest fairy tale traditions. The giving and the knowing of names, the discerning of names. This is fundamentally powerful. This is of absolute importance in ancient fairy tales, in ancient myth. You go back to the oldest stories, go back to Adam and Eve in the garden, whose purpose is the naming of things. You know, this is, of course, coincidentally echoing some discussions that we've been having of late over in There and Back Again, as we've discussed the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. The giving of names and the using of names is incredibly important because it defines and it limits. And we are, as ever here, combating the fear of the unknown. Yeah. As Hero of Time says, if it comes down to the strength of will and bravery when one faces a dark wizard, fear and doubt prove to be the perfect servants of the Dark Lord. That's exactly right. This isn't just a moral stand. This is also a practical stand. This has the virtue of pragmatism. This has the virtue of Professor Lupin's chipped cups and pocketful of chocolate pragmatism. He's ready to face the world as it is, but facing the world as it is means understanding it and naming it. This is going to be of vital importance as we keep pushing on. Oh, Joseph is making the comparison here with the Wizard of Earthsea. Yes, That's absolutely right. If you have read and enjoyed Harry Potter and have never read Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, I cannot recommend it highly enough. We will definitely do definitely a Point North one-shot on that, a one-off lecture discussing A Wizard of Earthsea, if not an entire series looking at it. It is a magnificent book, and Le Guin's kind of fundamental understanding of magic and the way that magic operates within her world is not just compatible to a certain extent with J.K. Rowling's understanding, but is beautifully resonant with that understanding. I like Harry Potter more after reading A Wizard of Earthsea. I like A Wizard of Earthsea more after reading Harry Potter. I think they sit very well together while being very different books. A Wizard of Earthsea, also a relatively slim volume, so you can race through it in no time at all. Okay. 4 minutes left, one slide left to go. Here we go. This is the end of our chapter. The fat lady had vanished from her portrait, which had been slashed so viciously that strips of canvas littered the floor. Great chunks of it had been torn away completely. Dumbledore took one quick look at the ruined painting and turned, his eyes somber, to see Professors McGonagall, Lupin, and Snape hurrying toward him. "We need to find her," said Dumbledore. "Professor McGonagall, please go to Mr. Filch at once and tell him to search every painting in the castle for the fat lady." "You'll be lucky," said a cackling voice. It was Peeves, the poltergeist, bobbing over the crowd and looking delighted as he always did at the sight of wreckage or worry. "What do you mean, Peeves?" said Dumbledore calmly, and Peeves' grin faded a little. He didn't dare taunt Dumbledore. Instead, he adopted an oily voice that was no better than his cackle. "Ashamed, your headship, sir. Doesn't want to be seen. She's a horrible mess. Saw her running through the landscape up on the 4th floor, sir, dodging between the trees, crying something dreadful," he said happily. "Poor thing," he added unconvincingly. "Did she say who did it?" "Oh, yes, Professor Head," said Peeves, with the air of one cradling a large bombshell in his arms. "He got very angry when she wouldn't let him in, you see." Peeves flipped over and grinned at Dumbledore from between his own legs. "Nasty temper he's got, that Sirius Black." Bombshell right there at the end, just to wrap up our chapter, just to drive us forward. Sirius Black is here. He's evaded the Dementors. He is inside Hogwarts. He was at the door to the Gryffindor common room. Things are about to kick into high gear. Let's see if we have any questions here right at the end. Gosh, I'm not sure what this is apropos of, but Mari says, adolescents experience more developed and mature feelings than we often give them credit for. Their brains are developed 95% by then and are completely biologically capable of adult emotions. Yes. That's a really strong observation, and certainly one of the reasons that these threshold stories, these adolescent threshold stories in particular, are so powerful, because in many ways it's not about biological development. It is about kind of social development. It is about, in a sense, a process of enculturalization. You know, we are becoming the people that we are expected to be, the people that we want to be. Certainly, hopefully, more often than not, that is the case. But the people that we are expected to be by the standards of our society and our culture. So it's more about a kind of how can I put this? Adolescence is less a personal, solitary transformation than it is a distributed, aggregate social transformation. If you are by yourself, you know, if you are a hermit, if you're trapped on an island like Oliver Queen, then maybe adolescence is going to be tough for you. Certainly there are, you know, a kind of physical, transformations which are going to be difficult for you to experience and difficult for you to reconcile. Certainly, yes, that is all true. But I feel as though the process of adolescent transformation is one of social integration, or not even necessarily complete integration, but kind of it exists within this social context, this broader social context, which makes it so difficult. It is why I think teenagers are so dependent upon the views and the perspectives of those around them. Part of achieving maturity is kind of disentangling oneself from those expectations. That is not to say that they are not important when you are an adolescent, but it is to say that they are kind of reframed into a more appropriate perspective as you approach and hopefully embrace and are embraced by maturity. But yes, that's a really great observation there, Mari. Thank you for that. Let me see as we wrap up here. No, that's good. I think we've caught up with everything. Oliver Queen was not alone on that island, said Jamie. Correct. True. Absolutely true facts. I was using it metaphorically. I should know better than to go to Arrow for metaphors. Next session, you guys, next week, we are introduced to, I mean, my favorite artifact, probably your favorite artifact too, in all of Harry Potter. Next week, chapters 9 and 10, Grim Defeat and the Marauders Map. That will take place at 10 p.m. Eastern, Tuesday, September 5th. There was some confusion today because I mislabeled the schedule that went out in the Point North newsletter. As ever, you can find the most up-to-date scheduling information for Point North by heading on over to pointnorthmedia.com and clicking the podcasts button. There you will see the calendar. The calendar is in Central Time, but you can adjust it to your local time zone. You can also subscribe to that calendar and get all kinds of notifications. I do apologize for the mistake in the newsletter. I will be more rigorous about it. You guys, time zones are just awful and the worst. And can we just please not with them? Would that be possible? I should just move to UTC and just do everything there. That would work out just fine. Okay, so next week, Grim Defeat and brilliantly the Marauders Map. I cannot wait for all of that. Guys, thank you so much. Look at that. All of those slides, 3 chapters done in an hour and a half. It's been an absolute pleasure, guys. This is just wonderful. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you so much for your conversations. You can, of course, get in touch with me at any point in the next week, either on Twitter using the hashtag Dear Mr. Potter or via email at pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. I read your thoughts with a great deal of interest. You guys are always so smart and so careful reading this book that you illuminate the pages for me every single week. It's just been an absolute pleasure, guys. Thanks so much for listening. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, take care. Mischief managed.